So, welcome again to everybody who is just coming in. My name is Michelle Hoare. I am the project director for Hey Neighbour Collective. Ryan, can you confirm with a head nod to me that the slides are sharing properly? Full screen? All right, head nods. Excellent. So, we are here today to talk about the Building Social Connections toolbox of design actions that Hey Neighbour Collective has been working with Happy Cities on. So you'll get to hear from Madeline Hebert, who is the true genius behind this work, her and her team at Happy Cities. And I'll explain a little bit more about how we work together in a moment. But before doing that, I will just talk about where I'm coming from. So I feel very privileged as a settler to live, work, and be raising children on the stolen and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, otherwise known as Vancouver, BC. And we would love to know where you are joining us from. So please add that into the chat. And if you know the Indigenous territories that you reside on, we would love for you to add that as well. So a little bit about who's here. We had over 300 people register. We'll see how many actually show up, but lots of interest in this, obviously, and from 19 countries. You're joining us from 19 countries. Most of us are here from Canada, but there is a scattering from all over the place, which is really quite fun. And we did a quick tally of kind of what kinds of professional backgrounds you're joining us from. So there were a number of you who decided to remain a mystery and not tell us where you work or what you do. But for those who did, there are a lot of planners and municipal governments in the room, lots of people from public health, lots of people in the housing sector, developers, housing operators, housing associations, different kinds. We've got lots of researchers, faculty, students, lots of architects, and shout out to the architecture firms that don't just have one person coming, but 4 or 5 of your team, which is really cool. We have some government housing agencies, so government organizations that own and operate housing. We've got lots of consultancies, community nonprofits, other kind of types of government agencies. And then some organizations
What?
that are very specifically focused
Yeah.
on seniors. I'll ask everybody to make sure that they stay muted during this time. That's the one potential downfall of the large meeting is that you can accidentally be talking over presenters. So I think Ryan will probably keep an eye on that. Okay, so just to make sure we're all awake and paying attention, we're going to do a quick little poll. So Ryan, if you wouldn't mind doing that, and I will stop my screen sharing while we do that. Okay, so this is asking about your personal familiarity with design practices that can help to foster social connections in multi-unit housing. I can see we've already got people madly participating, which is awesome. And Ryan will cut it off either when we have 100% of people participating or when it's slowed to a dribble. And then we'll just assume that some of you are just multitasking, reading your emails.
I am amazed at the speed. I have never
Yeah, I
seen
know,
people
it's coming in
so
fast.
quickly.
It's coming in fast. Already 90% of you have taken this poll, so we'll give it a few more seconds.
Well done.
Oh, it's slowing down. It's slowing down. We're at 91. Oh,
We're gonna
it
get
went
there.
back to 90. How does that work? All right. All right, I think it's slowed to a trickle, Ryan. So why don't we end the poll and see where we're at?
Oh,
Okay.
sorry. Pardon.
All right. So um, are people seeing the results here on the screen? No. Okay.
Pardon me. Is that showing for people?
Is it showing? Mark, I can see your face. All right, I'm seeing Mark Vanning nodding his head, so others can see it. Great. So about 32% of you are saying you're unfamiliar with kind of design best practices. 51% saying somewhat familiar, and 17 saying quite familiar. So there's a good range, really good range. All right, so I'll get back to sharing my screen. All right, and Ryan, can you give me another head nod? All right, excellent. Wonderful. So, um, going to pull way back to why we're doing this. Being socially connected with other humans, with our neighbors, is not a it's not a nice to have. It is actually really critical to human health and survival. Chronic loneliness and social isolation can be as damaging to our health as smoking 15 cigarettes a day and increases a premature risk of death by as much as 50%. And then conversely, strong social connections and supports are protective for physical and mental health, and they protect against cognitive decline. So these are not small things. These are very significant public health issues, the fact that we are seeing an increase in loneliness and social isolation. Um, but why does it matter that we know our neighbors particularly and have social connections? Um, I think really, particularly after the pandemic, and for those of us who've had the misfortune of experiencing, climate emergencies, natural hazards, we really see that knowing your neighbors is incredibly important. So not just for the big acute disasters that we all face at the same time, but just for the chronic stressors in life, right? If you know your neighbors and you can trust them, um, and you feel like you can both offer help and accept help, then when you have those small emergencies in your life, you have somebody to support you. And over time, that builds up to, a really impactful improvement in our quality of life, in our health and our well-being, and across all age categories. So I'm not going to walk through this slide about particular benefits to knowing your neighbors well, but we have a great evidence backgrounder done by a PhD candidate at SFU, that we'd encourage you to go check out if you want to learn more. So I'll just say a quick thing about Hey Neighbour Collective, because I'm guessing a number of you on the call are not super familiar with us yet. Hey Neighbour Collective is a collective impact project composed of a whole wide range of partners who are all working towards kind of a common cause or mission. So we are housing providers, non-governmental organizations, community nonprofits, regional governments, local governments, health authorities, researchers, all interested in how we mitigate loneliness and social isolation within housing contexts. So, what can we do through intentional programming, but also through design of new housing, to work towards a future where more of Canada's multi-unit housing communities are socially connected, age-friendly, neighborly, health promoting, and resilient. And two of our partners, one that you'll hear from today directly is Happy Cities. They're a private consultancy that we've partnered with since 2019, and been a really key partner in our work. And it's just a lot of fun to collaborate with them. So you'll hear from Madeline. And then Metro Vancouver has been a partner as well since the beginning of the project, and our work with them over time has actually created real policy windows that have helped us to work um, with municipalities locally. So just very quickly, I'll tell you a little bit about how this work on design toolkits came about. Starting in 2020, we started doing kind of research and making recommendations to Metro, to inform their next regional growth strategy. We did workshops, we did discussion papers, and when the regional growth strategy was passed in February 2023, there's a little nugget now in the housing section that says that all member jurisdictions, and there are over 20 municipalities, First Nation governments, and kind of electoral areas within Metro. So all of these jurisdictions need to adopt regional context statements that identify which policies and actions help to increase social connectedness in multi-unit housing. Now, of course, this is one of very many things that the regional growth strategy asks member municipalities to do, but it actually gave us a window to work directly with municipalities who are interested. And this quote I really like, from a workshop participant, an architect who I believe might actually even be registered for this session. So, Richard Evans, if you're on this call, um, this is my attempt to paraphrase what you said that day, which was a real light bulb moment for me. And that is that the desire for socially connected, spaces and housing, and and communities really is really in so many of our overarching plans. But the vision for that gets filtered out because it's not actually mandated anywhere or guided or incentivized in actual development processes. So we're really hoping that this work helps to do that. So over the last 12 months, we've been doing this project that we call Building Social Connections. It's had 3 phases. The first was doing a report on the City of North Vancouver's active design guidelines, which have been going since 2015. So doing a little bit of an audit of how well that policy has worked in creating more kind of active and socially connected multi-unit housing. We had a series of 4 full-day workshops with 6 Metro jurisdictions and Tsawwassen First Nation, looking at how we could co-create policy that would help to incentivize this kind of design. And then phase 3 coming out of all that work is the toolkit that we'll be presenting today to you. And so the jurisdictions we worked with were the cities of Burnaby, New Westminster, North Vancouver, Surrey, Vancouver, and Tsawwassen First Nation. And so now we are in this process of disseminating the information in the toolkit, and we'll be doing more dissemination over the next year and beyond. We'll be doing some training sessions, which Madeline will talk about, cross-sectoral gatherings, building tours, case studies, and more. So please follow along with us as we go. So today's agenda, I am going to wrap up my chat very quickly. Then we'll pass it on to Madeline, who will talk about the toolkit. We've invited Raymond Can on to ask the first question, and then we'll go into an open question period. My colleague Ryan will be collecting questions from the chat as we go. So please add your questions whenever they come up. She'll be monitoring and choosing questions where themes are emerging, kind of repeatedly. So just wanted to thank all of the funders from the last year and the 2 years, starting now that we'll be continuing to do this work. I won't name them all, but thank you very much. Your support is making so much possible. And then I'm just going to wrap up with a reflection on this work that really keeps being reinforced, as we go into year 6 of this project. And I know Madeline's going to talk about this too, but design is really important. It's really important that we actually create built environments that help to make us feel welcome, comfortable, where it's easy to talk to our neighbors and build relationships and have a space to gather and socialize and organize. That's so important. But the bedrock of that is affordability and safety and tenure security. If we're not building affordable, secure tenure supply, it's just, kind of sometimes if I'm feeling saucy, and I'm feeling saucy right now, I'll say it's the cherry on top of a shit cake, right? Like if people can't actually afford where they're living, they don't have security of tenure, they're constantly having to move. It doesn't matter how beautiful their building is. They don't have the time to put down roots. They don't have the energy to connect. Because why would you if you feel like you're going to have to move in 6 months or 2 years? So I won't go into this, but really there's so much about our policy around housing when you look at a government level, but also at a building level. What you do in design is really important. So if you're layering design on top of a stable, affordable model, and of course there's lots of ranges of affordability, then people can actually be there long enough to start to feel a sense of belonging to a place, and over time to actually engage more actively, with neighbors. So I'm going to stop sharing so that Madeline can take control of her slides and lead us onward in the conversation.
Awesome. Thank you, Michelle. Okay, let me share my screen. Okay. Hopefully you can see that now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. Awesome. Yeah. So as Michelle said, this project is really a culmination of the efforts of so many people who have been working in this wonderful space of thinking about what we really need to build sociable, inclusive communities. And this work is getting more and more relevant as we're seeing that loneliness and isolation are actually on the rise in many of our cities. This data is from 2021, so 3 in 10 Canadians feel sometimes lonely, and 1 in 10 often feel lonely. So these are numbers that we're seeing consistently across many of our surveys that are looking at different population groups and different cities. So the problem really is, intergenerational, intercultural, and it's happening in all of our cities. And, as Michelle said, this affordability, choice of housing, security of tenure is really the foundation for everything that we're talking about today. So I'm pulling up this diagram, which I like to show often. So what we're really trying to illustrate is the spectrum of neighborly social interactions. And all of these types of interactions are actually really good for our well-being and our health. And what we're really talking about is social well-being, which is the extent to which you have relationships with your community, you have a sense of belonging, you feel included in your social environments. And that kind of overall satisfaction with social relationships, which is strongly linked to mental health and physical health outcomes. And these can include casual encounters that you have with the grocery store clerk or your local barista or your neighbor that you talk to once in a while in front of the mailboxes, all the way to these really, really strong mutually supportive relationships where you're relying on your neighbors for childcare, or you're sharing a car, or they're your core support group when you're having a bad day. So this is really what we're talking about. And what we're really trying to see is what helps communities build all of these layers of social interaction, and how can we use architecture and the built environment, along with other things like programming and policy, to help move more of our communities towards mutual support. And really, the design principles and actions are informed by conversations that we've been having with people across the housing industry, from policymakers to planners to designers and to community members who actually live in these buildings and experience them day to day. And housing is always an interesting topic, because even though we have a professional opinion about housing, you all have lived experience of housing, and so it's always a really interesting conversation. So we designed this toolkit for planners, planning consultants, architects and designers, market and non-market housing developers and operators, all levels of government, as well as individual residents. So I think it's pretty exciting from the early data that Michelle showed that actually all of these groups are represented today. And obviously the toolkit is pretty long. We hope that it's also an easy read. We tried to make it as accessible as possible. So I won't go through everything in the toolkit today, but please check it out on our website. But really, it's a recognition that, in these growing challenges that Michelle mentioned, housing affordability crisis, extreme weather, social isolation, and aging population, our social connections are one of our strongest resources, and we really want to build those in any way that we can. So our toolkit really seeks to give knowledge on how to rebuild those social connections back into our day-to-day lives, which starts with our housing. So the toolkit is kind of organized into these 4 design categories or toolboxes. So we look at kind of the social building edges, social circulation, social amenity spaces, and social health. So you'll see that we go beyond just thinking about traditional amenity spaces like a rooftop patio or a lounge, but we really think about where social interaction is happening in all areas of the building, from the sequence as you're like walking through the neighborhood, arriving at your front door, all the way when you're living in your private unit. And what we really named this is kind of an outcome-based approach. So we seek to shift how we talk about housing design towards designing for social well-being as a key outcome, rather than prescribing set solutions. And this is really a recognition of the diversity of needs and contexts that our housing projects actually exist in. So these 6 principles have been really outlined in the toolkit as a way to think about, semi-private spaces, public spaces, and everything in between, and how we can apply this to our buildings. And obviously we recognize that not every building will be able to do everything in the toolkit, but it is presented as a menu of options, and every kind of intentional moment that you have in the design process of your housing is going to lead to better outcomes down the road. So I'll go through the 6 principles quickly. The first one is really location. So what we're talking about is maximizing opportunities for interaction by locating social features and spaces in convenient, visible, and prominent locations, thinking about things like natural light, which help draw people to spaces, and then multiplying that social impact through co-location. This is really about making the best of what we are able to resource in a building. So for example, a lot of courtyard buildings are really great examples of this. They have, the outdoor social space, and then they'll co-locate their lobby, their indoor spaces all together, and you get this kind of triangulation of social activity, which really can become the heart of the community. We also see that in mixed-use communities where you see public amenities blending with transitioning into private space, and you really get these lively and strong building edges. The next principle is invitation. So what we're trying to do is maximizing those spontaneous daily encounters, because basically the premise is if you never bump into your neighbors, how could you possibly get to them? So this is really what this design principle is about. And really we're talking how the built environment can actually serve as an icebreaker. So we hear this a lot in our conversations with residents. Is like, this feature like a community garden or this bench that's really well placed actually acts as an icebreaker for social interaction. So, this building lobby for the seniors building, they've got this really nice seating area outside the building. Everything is kind of intentionally thought out to say that you will, walk by this social community as you come home. The next principle, activation. So we're really trying to create interesting functional spaces that people actually want to use. So it's not enough to just say, here's a room with some tables and chairs, and expect that people will make that central to their day-to-day life. So what is the person's reason for actually going into that space? So you'll see this particular building by David Baker Architects has, a wonderful courtyard that's designed for intergenerational interaction. So they have, direct access to the laundry room. They have an indoor-outdoor connection to the courtyard. They've got these visual connections into the courtyard from the balconies. They've got community gardens. They've got this informal play area with public art integrated. So there's a lot of reasons why you and your family would actually want to spend time in this space. The next one is inclusion. So this is really thinking about who is using the space and what are their needs. So this is thinking about accessibility needs, age-friendly needs, thinking about different cultural preferences for interaction as well. Another David Baker example, I really like their buildings. If you haven't noticed, there's a lot of them in the toolkit. Yeah, so this seniors building, again, is really doing a nice job with these transitional spaces, which are really important for social interaction. So they've got natural light coming into their corridor, these enhanced accessibility features. They've got their artwork, a little social nook, a community notice board. So there's all these reasons to kind of linger in the space and spend time with your neighbors. The next one is really important. So transition is, we're not saying that everyone has to be on all the time and interacting all the time, but actually these boundaries that we can create with the built environment between the private and public realm are so important for people to feel like they have a place where they can rest and recharge, but then a place where they can kind of choose when they want to interact with others. So, examples like this are active edges with stoops, where you have a kind of a transition zone between your private building and the public realm. And then also thinking about really livable units with good acoustics where you don't hear your neighbors, lots of natural light so that you feel kind of comfortable at home and much more likely to interact. And finally, this last one is evolution. So this is something that we often see in buildings like co-ops and co-housing communities where people are really intentional about the relationships of their building. And this is like, how are the spaces evolving to meet the needs of residents? So, as architects, we often walk away from our projects as kind of static objects, but they're actually these really dynamic spaces that are going to continue to change over time as people interact with them. And I think that's the beauty that is really difficult to embrace at a policy level to understand, how is this space going to actually evolve? And again, this is where we've been studying a lot of co-housing communities because they do such a wonderful job at doing this, at making sure that these spaces actually evolve with their residents. So yeah, the toolkit is really meant to be really user-friendly. It's really about nurturing social well-being in housing for people of all ages, backgrounds, abilities, household sizes, and incomes. It's encouraging people to take a flexible approach that can be applied across different scales and contexts. And it really should be considered in relation to local policy. So if this is not working with what is already out there, it can also pose a barrier to more development. And we know there's a lot of push from a lot of municipalities right now to build housing faster and more efficiently. So I think this is also a piece that we need to remember, that the buildings that we're designing now are going to be with us for a very long time. And if we have these best practices now, then we should be implementing them in the buildings as much as we can. And again, recognizing that the design of new buildings is just a small area for action in the whole spectrum of social connection. So we also have existing buildings, which some of them have great communities already, and some of them can have solutions through programming, for example, or retrofits. So these are ideas that we're exploring in other parts of the project as well. Recognizing the need for these regulations not to just apply to market buildings for people who can afford high rents or can afford to buy a place, but really the importance for this across our housing spectrum, from supportive housing to non-market housing. And then running in tangential is this really strong importance on supporting programming and operations that actually helps you use these spaces in the way that they were intended. So as if you're coming to this and say, okay, so what do I do with this toolkit? It looks really great. What are my next steps? So what we really encouraged the municipalities that we're working with is to take a broad look at the well-being context. So what is already being done in your policies, whether you're a housing developer or an operator, in terms of well-being. And that might look at, it might come under different terms, community well-being, social sustainability, age-friendly. All of these kind of topics are interrelated. And really understanding, if you're a municipality, to take stock of what is your current housing regulation saying. We've also encouraged people to look at opportunities to consolidate. So if you're already, consolidating a bunch of regulations to make the process simpler, where can you insert these ideas around social interaction and social connection? And then it's really about setting goals and intentions. So what are you really trying to accomplish? Thinking very carefully about those outcomes for people. And then, whether you choose to design a new building or, design a new policy or modify an existing policy. And the other key piece is kind of thinking about what your incentives and levers are to make sure that people are actually going to follow through with these ideas. So I just want to give you a couple examples. This was the Port Moody Social Wellbeing Design Guidelines. So we were able to work with the City of Port Moody to develop these. What they're really providing is incentives and guidelines for multi-unit housing that supports social well-being and residents. And we co-created this policy with developers, architects, and the community. So it's now been passed by council. They're kind of in the implementation phase. But yeah, I encourage you to check it out as an example on our page. And it has pretty detailed illustrations about some flexible opportunities to make spaces more socially connected. The other piece is we're very lucky to be able to work with the City of North Vancouver to actually evaluate their active design guidelines. So the active design guidelines has been a really innovative policy that the City of North Van has had since 2015. So they're quite ahead of the curve in terms of getting these ideas into policy. So we really wanted to see, can we evaluate what the impact of that has been? And I believe the link for that report was shared already, but we kind of did building audits. We looked at, how are people actually using these spaces now that they're built? We talked with residents, we talked with property managers, developers, and architects who had actually worked with the policy, as well as staff. So we really wanted to build a kind of complete understanding of how it was working. Oops, sorry. and I know I'm out of time, so I won't get into too many details, but we have a really exciting opportunity coming up, national training sessions, which CMHC is helping us fund. So we're going to have limited spots available for the live sessions. It'll be 3 online cumulative learning sessions, and we really want participation from folks across Canada. Our focus has really been on BC because it's where we're based, but we think that these ideas have impact, can have national impact. And, there'll be really exciting opportunities to learn from guests across the industry. So yeah, if you're interested in participating in this or learning more, please feel free to message us, and our emails are at the end as well. The registration will probably be live in November.
And Madeline, I'll just interject. Do you mind if I interject quickly? So the live spots will be held for Canadian attendees, but all of the presentations and the resources that we create for these trainings will be open source, shared, so anybody can access them from anywhere around the world. So for our participants who are coming in from other countries, you can learn alongside us, but it'll be through recordings and materials. And yeah.
Awesome. Thanks for adding that, Michelle. Yeah, and Michelle and I are going to be very busy talking about this work over the next few months as well. So maybe we will see some of you at these conferences. Livable Cities Forum coming at the end of October, the Canadian Human Connection Conference, Housing Central, which I'm sure many of you might be at. Michelle is going to be part of the Climate Action Dialogues with Metro Vancouver. And then we're going to be making our way to Toronto in February to present at the Regeneration Forum. So yeah, we're really excited to be connecting with people on this work. And yeah, please keep in touch with us. Fill out our webinar evaluation. Sign up for our e-newsletters. Both of our organizations have e-newsletters that we send out that always have interesting stories. Share the toolkit across your municipality with developers that you work with other folks that you work with. And please get in touch and tell us about your work. We really want to hear what folks are doing with this toolkit, how implementation is going. And we really want to build those opportunities to make sure that all of this work that has been many, many years in the making is actually going to make it in the right hands and actually have an impact on the people who are going to be living in these buildings. And yeah, I think that's my time. So thank you very much.
That's great. Thanks so much, Madeline. So I can see that people are popping questions in, which is wonderful. And I'm sure Ryan is busily taking note of what kind of themes are popping up. So, but I will first of all invite Raymond Can to join us quickly and lob the first question. Hi, Raymond.
Hi, good morning, Michelle.
And sorry, I'll just introduce you quickly too. So Raymond is the Manager of Research and Policy at the Planning Institute of British Columbia, and he is also a director on the board of the Canadian Institute for Planners. So over to you, Raymond.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Madeline. Yeah, congratulations to the Hey Neighbour Collective for this milestone. At the Planning Institute of BC, we're always happy to stay connected on these leading edge applied research. And we're equally happy to amplify these best practices for the benefit of our member planners and other practitioners in BC and Yukon. Yeah, so I have a couple of starter questions for you, Madeline. First one is the team has produced really an extensive library of work over the last few years. So today's toolkit, technical reports, and guidelines for different audiences. Can we look forward to these toolkits and guidelines being produced in other languages in the future to help expand the reach of your work and implementation? And then a second question, as you mentioned, the team will be really busy rolling out the toolkit through national training sessions over the next several months. Just looking ahead, I'm curious about the next big thing that the team may be thinking about tackling. Michelle mentioned about affordable housing in her opening remarks. And what are some ways for folks to get involved?
All right. That's actually 3 sneaky questions, Raymond.
Yeah.
All right, you go. You go
Yeah,
first, Madeline.
I'll go on the first one on the language thing. Yeah, we would absolutely love to see some, like the toolkit translated in French, for example. It is something that we've talked about with CMHC. We don't currently have the funding to do it. My first language is actually French, so I would love to have opportunities to share this in our second official language as well.
And we could go beyond that. Yeah,
exactly,
I mean,
yeah,
it'd be
like
great to do more than just French. Yeah.
yeah.
So if anybody has any spare funding out there to help us translate these or wants to do the translation for us,
yeah, we would be very happy to do it. Yeah. I think the second question, Michelle, can you remind me? Sorry.
I think the second question was
Oh,
around what's the next big thing that we're
yeah,
thinking about? Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Do you want to take a stab at that and then I will?
yeah, sure. So I think one thing that I'm really excited about is that we are in conversations with some of the 6 jurisdictions that were part of our original workshops to actually work with them on implementation. So that's going to look different. It's going to look slightly different for each one because they're working from different contexts. But that's what I'm really excited about. And I think as we get more examples, if we have the Port Moody example, the North Van example, as we see what other municipalities are doing, what we'll actually be able to do is pull out, sample policy statements or like really detailed roadmaps that will help other jurisdictions do this work very easily and efficiently and integrate it into their processes. So that's what we really want to do, is make this as easy and implementable as possible. So that's the piece I'm working on, and I think the other piece, like long term, that I'm excited about is like continuing the kind of research and data collection to build the case for this. So one thing we get asked a lot about is like, what's the cost implication of a lot of these toolkit design features? And that can be really hard to quantify, especially that no one has really been collecting data on, like, first of all, we need to understand, what design decisions were made early on in the design process that, for example, designing a bar building versus a courtyard building. So the courtyard building we know is going to inherently have more social opportunities if it's well designed. So how do we measure, this courtyard building costs, 10% more or 20% more? How do we justify that with funders and really make the case for these building features? So that's the piece that I think I'm also interested in from a research perspective.
I'm just going to note, I don't know how if everybody's following the chat, but we've had offers to help with the Japanese and Chinese language version so far. So
oh, very
hey,
cool.
that's awesome.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll be reaching out. That's really cool. And there might be others too. These are just the ones I've noticed. But yeah, I'm excited about the same things as Madeline talks about. Also, that we are talking with funders, with CMHC, with BC Housing, because it's not just about local governments setting policy and incentivizing and understanding these kinds of best practices. It's also about the funders of the housing understanding this and making it more possible, because there is a real push towards, like, let's just get as many units built as we can really quickly. And these aren't units, they're homes. And crediting Robert Brown with that reminder to just not call them units, they're homes. And so we really need to think about the longevity of these spaces and what more they can do for us, because housing is a lot more than just 4 walls and a roof, right? It's essential infrastructure, really. It's economic infrastructure, it's health infrastructure, it's social infrastructure, it's emergency infrastructure, safety infrastructure. If you really think about it. And so we need to think beyond just unit count and getting these things
Yeah.
up quickly. They need to be, excellent, resilient housing.
Yeah, and I'll add one more thing on partnerships. We're also going to be joined by Renewable Cities, which is another amazing project out of the Center for Dialogue. So their focus has really been on, resilience, climate solutions, and what we're really also starting to look at is the co-benefits between these sociable features, climate resilience, and we also know that social connection with your neighbors is actually a huge undervalued tool for resilient communities. So yeah, also excited about that work that's going to evolve.
Mm-hmm. And then lastly, I'm just going to say I'm really excited to be starting to think, with help from Renewable Cities and others about retrofits. So currently there's, quite a lot of investment and political attention to decarbonizing and retrofitting existing buildings that do have lifespan in them still. And what are the opportunities during those, pretty substantive processes to maybe inject some thinking around resident engagement, social connection, and nature-based solutions? What could we do in the exterior of these buildings to be kind of multi-solving for urban tree canopy, urban agriculture, shade, rain gardens, rain capture, all sorts of, opportunities there that are um, exploratory at this stage. So I feel like we could go on and on with your question, Raymond, but let's turn it over to some of the questions that are popping up in the chat. And so thank you, Raymond. Thanks for coming on and being ready with the first questions. And Ryan, what question have you picked to be next?
Oh my, we have quite a robust chat going on. This is great. Thank you so much for the questions, everyone. We have a couple that are similar, so I'm going to kind of combine a couple for both of you, and they have to do with existing buildings. A few folks have asked, many buildings already have community spaces like party rooms or rooftop patios, but they see little to no use, or they're not well utilized, and perception is that they're not always well utilized. So one question is why or why not? Why are they used or not? And then do you think a cultural nudge to talk to your neighbor would help? And are new designs evaluated to know what does and doesn't work and why? So sorry.
Oh, those are two big questions. Let's start. Let's go with them in order. Madeline, do you want to tackle the first one around why don't spaces get used?
Yeah. So this has been a topic that we have been researching. So we've had lots of conversations with property managers and landlords, and yeah, we understand that the operation of these spaces is actually so important. So we've actually seen several examples where, for example, the policies to use the space are prohibitive. So for example, if you have to pay a fee to use the room, that becomes a barrier for people. If it doesn't have open flexible hours where you can drop in, it becomes kind of a thing that people use not regularly in their day-to-day. Another piece, that is hard to change, obviously, is where it's actually located. So we actually do see a lot of these buildings where people have few interactions where they actually kind of bump into their neighbors. So they'll go from, their parking garage up the elevator to their unit. So they don't really have kind of an excuse to visit these spaces. Whereas like if you think of a building where you're coming into the lobby, the room is right there. So you actually see it every day. You see like activity happening in those spaces. That's kind of a reminder to say like, hey, there's things happening with your neighbors. So I think that piece is really important. But in terms of, Hey Neighbour Collective has been doing a ton of evaluation, and I'll let Michelle speak to like the programs that Hey Neighbour Collective has actually been evaluating. But programming is actually a huge piece of making these spaces successful. I think the other piece too is, yeah, absolutely. Like there is a cultural nudge. And that's why we talk about, the built environment as an icebreaker or an invitation. And we always hear, kids, community gardens, and pets, those are icebreakers to say, I'm much more comfortable having a conversation with a stranger if I'm with my dog or if I'm, picking apples in my traffic circle like Michelle does, right? Those are kind of invitations to say, like, I'm open to interacting. So there is definitely a cultural shift. But I think what can happen is as we start to see more of these features well designed into buildings, they're going to start to be used and people are going to actually start valuing them and understanding like, I know what this social, nook is for in my hallway where I have a little seating area in a library, and that'll be something that is actually desirable for people.
Yeah, and Madeline, I know you said this earlier in your presentation, but there's so much of it, though maybe I'll come back to this. I think sometimes when we think about like common spaces and amenities, we think about the bookable big room that you can have a party in. Or we think about that maybe you've got a fancy building that's got a media room or something, but there are these very programmed, purposeful spaces, the places where people actually see and meet their neighbors and develop that even just the facial familiarity at first it's hallways, it's entryways, it's parking lots, it's mailboxes, it's the functional and circulatory spaces in the building. So if we can wrap our heads around the building as a social ecosystem of interrelated spaces, then you think about the design differently. You think about co-locating, you think about one thing flowing to another. And then if you design it that way and you also reduce barriers to use, like you don't lock it up all the time, or you support the use of it, right? And this can be a difficult thing because property managers are really busy, and they have lots of other roles and responsibilities. And there's concerns a lot in that space, in that sector, about liability, right? Are people going to use it wrong? Are they going to trash it? Are they going to do bad things in it? And so there's this mind shift that I think needs to happen, that if you can actively program stuff, then there's a different culture emerges. But I do think that the cost liability is a big one with some of the more expensive types of common amenities. I definitely hear from a lot of people, even living, owning their spaces in strata buildings, where it's like, oh, we've shut down the pool because we can't afford to run it or something. So that's a whole other conversation. But yeah.
Yeah, and I think the other challenge for existing buildings is that, if your building has a history of negative interactions between neighbors or negative interactions in your strata, or committee, or between landlord and tenant, those relationships can be really hard to overcome. And I absolutely think that there needs to be resources developed, to help strata say, let's look at our policies and see how we actually interact with each other. And yeah, it's not easy work to do. And that has been one of the key goals from working with co-housing communities, is understanding that, yeah, of course, not everyone is going to live in co-housing or want to live in co-housing, but they do a lot of really great things around intentional support and mutual support, and the way that they interact with each other, that we can learn from and hopefully share across. Well, rental housing is a little bit easier, but I think stratas are also an area that needs its own kind of research project or resources.
Yeah, and I think too, it's that we have lots of really great examples of housing operators, both market and non-market, partnering with other community groups that can come in and actually kind of run programming, so that it's not the landlord or the strata that needs to do it. There's an outside entity partnering that has some expertise and can develop a different relationship with residents. I'm cognizant of time, so the other one was about I think about kind of do we do much to understand buildings once they're built, right? Yeah. So that the short answer to that is no. There's very little post-occupancy work done. And there's a huge appetite from the conversations we've had to date, from local governments to do that. But it's not in budgets, it's not in the staff expertise. So I think there is a significant amount of space to be doing that more, so that we understand the impact of what it is we're building. Especially if we are going to shift policy to incentivize, better design, we want to understand if that's working, if it's working the way we intended it to. I see that a real kind of movement around that happening in the UK right now, which is pretty interesting. So maybe we'll have to do a session on that specifically. But let's move to another question, Ryan.
Thank you so much, both of you. That was excellent. We also got a couple of questions similarly to the previous set, interrelated. And I think you touched on this at the end of perhaps your presentation or in the very beginning of the discussion, Madeline. But some of the principles of the design guideline can also have co-benefits related to increasing resilient climate impacts. Have you been working with folks that work in that space, or would you want to? And then along those same lines, participants are curious about intersections between social well-being, climate resilience, and the building design, air circulation quality, energy efficiency, etc. Are those considerations taken into account in your work?
Yeah, definitely an area that we're really interested in, and throughout kind of all of our work, we try to bring the lenses of what are we responding to? So social isolation and loneliness is one thing, but we're also looking at affordability. We can't ignore those kinds of big elephants in the room, as we call them. Climate change, responding to all these things. So again, like as I
Aging
mentioned,
demographics is another huge one. Yeah.
Yeah, and all of these things are interrelated. So what we're really looking at is like, how can we build housing in the best possible way to respond to our current and kind of future issues with, at the center of all of these conversations is person well-being. So how is someone, sort of thriving through these really challenging times that may be coming up ahead for us. So yeah, Michelle, maybe you want to talk about kind of the Renewable Cities partnership too?
Yeah. Hey Neighbour Collective is housed at the SFU Center for Dialogue, and another one of the projects there is Renewable Cities. And they're going to be working with us over the next 2 years to kind of keep rolling out this program. And one of the things we'll be doing is doing more kind of case studies and like toolkit expansions around kind of this issue of the poly crisis and how do we multi-solve, right? So if we're looking at some of the sociable design features, are they also ones that do help with like cross ventilation or units that have more, daylight, more outdoor space? There's so much complexity, but yes, it's very much going to be a stronger focus for this project going forward, is looking at the climate aspect. And the whole focus on social connections and neighborly social connections is incredibly important in time of climate crisis, because we are seeing more and more, crises, whether it's extreme heat or floods or fires. And so we really need to, in every way possible, be creating stronger kind of social cohesion in our housing and our neighborhoods and our communities, to be responding to this time. Ryan, let's have another.
Perfect. I think we have one that could be a good wrap up. I know we are getting close to our time. So this one asks, from your point of view, both of you, out of all of the recommendations and actions, which ones would you suggest are the best place to start and or have the highest impact? Of course, full integration of these principles, actions, and suggestions are key, but just thinking about approaches for incremental changes if that's where organizations are at the moment.
Yeah, I would riff off your point earlier, Michelle, is like just this intentional thinking about the building as a social ecosystem. So I think if you have that as like a key, design part of your design brief, to say like, I want to maximize the opportunities for social interaction and also for, social choice in my building. So how do I do that? So it's about going, beyond having one or two big social spaces, but really thinking intentionally about those transitional spaces. So I would say like, yeah, look at your lobbies, your corridors, that like transition zone right outside your building. I think those are places where you can do these pretty small interventions that will make the space a lot more welcoming and start to
don't
build
incur
those
really high costs. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think that's where I would focus on. Obviously courtyard buildings are great, but not suitable for many site types in our cities. So if you don't want to create a narrow courtyard that doesn't get any sunlight, it can also add a lot of expenses and has some energy implications. So I would say, yeah, think really intentionally about where you're placing the blocks of social connection within your building.
And co-locating them as much as possible so that there's a kind of a logical flow between them. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not like one thing on the 7th floor and another thing in the basement and another thing up there. Yeah. I mean, not that there can't be, different shared amenities in different spaces, but scattering them in the least marketable, least sellable areas is not a winning formula for making sure they get used. And then what happens with that is planners then think that we don't need those share spaces because no one uses the ones that exist. But the ones that exist are often poorly designed, not accessible, have high barriers to use, not actively programmed, all that.
Yeah, and if you're a developer or a housing operator, we really encourage you to kind of learn from your current building. So your residents are your greatest resource. I know a lot of developers and landlords are now doing surveys. So start thinking about can we add surveys about how people use common spaces and why they use them and why they don't, to really be open to say, like, if you realize that you have a policy that's preventing use, can you figure out a way for your organization to change that policy to encourage use? So yeah, I think there's go ahead.
Nope, you finish.
No, I was going to say that I think there's a lot of subtle actions that you can take in both existing and new designs.
Yeah, I was just going to say that too, is that some of these, even though this toolkit is mostly looking at new buildings, I think there are principles and design actions in there that you could apply to, small tweaks or retrofits or redesigns of spaces without completely changing the building structure. So it is 4 minutes to 11, at least in the Pacific time zone. So I will thank everybody for coming, thank our funders, but also say that if people do want to spend a few more minutes with us, I don't know about you, Madeline, if you've got a hard stop at 11, I'm happy to stick around another 10 or 15 minutes and answer a few more questions if people would like. So if you want to hang a little later, Madeline, would that be another few minutes to answer another question or two? Yeah?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. All right, great. So why don't we as I said, thank you everybody for coming and spending this hour with us. Please do, if you can take a moment, make sure you fill out that evaluation survey that Noni is putting in the chat. It really does help us to think about how we structure the next webinar workshop convening. It's really helpful. And I hope you all have a wonderful day.
Yeah,
all
thank
right.
you for joining us.
Let's keep going. Let's do another one or two.
All right. Perfect. Someone asked, oh, I just lost it. Hold on 1 second. What kind of incentives are cities considering to help implement these design policies into projects?
Yeah, so I can talk about what the city of Port Moody is proposing to do. So they have actually attached specific bonus FSR bonuses, basically. So
floor space ratio for those who are
floor space ratio. So basically saying you can build a little bit more density if you provide these spaces that go above and beyond for social interaction. Another one that we did was parking relaxations as well. So an example of that is the Little Mountain co-housing project in Vancouver. They got parking relaxations from the city of Vancouver, and with that kind of money that they saved and the space that they saved, they were actually able to put a workshop and a music room in their parkade. So they were able to actually, replace those parking spots that they, the community said we really don't need them. And I know there is so much changing in BC right now in terms of, places are removing parking minimums. They're changing how they're thinking about density and how they're calculating density. There's conversations about so many things that are changing. But I do still think that there are leverage points. So I think there are opportunities both to kind of integrate this into, official community plans or zoning bylaws or form and character guidelines. But I think incentives are a really nice way for cities to be able to test these and be able to evaluate the impact and the uptake without fearing to significantly impact the feasibility and viability of projects. So that was the approach that the city of Port Moody did. So I'll give you an example. One feature that we've really been seeing in a lot of co-housing communities are these social nooks. So they're kind of small seating areas off corridors. And if they're well located, they can be really important spaces for small social groups to form. So one of the guidelines in the Port Moody guidelines is actually guidance on designing a good social nook. And actually that corridor area actually gets exempt from the density calculation. So that's a way to kind of offset the additional cost to developers. And again, this is all kind of experimental in some ways. So we're really going to be following with the city to see, you know, what is happening with implementation. But we did get pretty good response from the developers and architects who kind of helped us refine and develop the guidelines.
I think also, cities can be looking at, different approval processes, faster lanes for affordable housing that is also doing this, for example, and looking at ways to um, to support affordability first and foremost, right? Because as I said, if you just do beautiful design but only on high-end market rental buildings and condos, it doesn't help, many of us who don't have those options. So yeah, so really thinking about, okay, this is really important work, but there are certain segments of the housing development sector who will do this because it's marketable, right? Because people want to live in places like this, so they can fold it into the cost. It might not be as much of a barrier, but for people actually trying to build, attainable and more deeply affordable housing, if their funders aren't really understanding the importance of this, then they're trying to get to the highest unit count for whatever they've got. And so, whatever cities can do to make that easier to get affordable housing built, is going to help, right? It's going to help speed things up, and time is money, all of that. That we actually have a great webinar that we did with Robert Brown, and he is just a wizard on housing finance. So Noni, if maybe you could pop that one in again, but we actually heard from uh, we actually heard from a really important partner that they made everybody on their team watch the webinar for training purposes. So it's quite a good one if you want to kind of understand how local governments can help affordable housing projects get off the ground more smoothly. Mhm. All right, how about we do one more, or maybe two more if they're quick ones, and then we will say a final goodbye.
Okay, thank you. Let's see here. I had one. Oh, you have this was a little bit earlier in the chat. Someone asked, you might have touched on this a bit, but what advice or resources can we share with stratas and building councils to make their condos more interaction friendly? This person said, I'm thinking buildings that are already built and do not have existing communal spaces.
Yeah. Noni, maybe if you haven't already, could you pop a link to our practice guides into the chat? So Hey Neighbour Collective, about less than 2 years ago, put out a series of practice guides about how you do this in existing housing. And so they're catered towards different types of readers. So one is around what can you do through resident engagement, like resident engaged models, where residents are taking a real leadership role in this. What can housing operators do? What do partnerships between housing operators and community nonprofits look like in this space? What is the role of local government? So those, I think, are all, can all be pretty helpful. They don't speak particularly to a strata context, but most of the lessons would be transferable. And yeah, I mean, we'll be telling lots of stories over the next little while about that kind of work. So if you're not on our e-newsletter, I would definitely recommend that. And then, whatever we are releasing about our partners programming and what's working and how, we'll get straight to you. But yeah, I think there's a lot that people can do in existing buildings. It is harder if you don't have communal spaces to gather and socialize with each other. But that doesn't mean it's impossible, right? Maybe you need to look at where you can gather outside. Is there a park nearby? Is there a community center, a neighborhood house? Can you repurpose any spaces? Is there a big lawn that nobody uses because there's nothing on it? Could you do something with that? So yeah, I think there's lots that can be done, but it is all kind of contingent on slowly building relationships with your neighbors, right? You can't go from not knowing anybody to having a magically connected community in 2 months. Um, it takes some time.
Yeah, and we were able to do a kind of long-term study of our urban village co-housing in Vancouver. So we did a kind of research report. So I encourage you to check that one out if you want to kind of learn about like what it takes to actually build these communities, because we did really in-depth interviews and conversations with residents. And yeah, it's hard work to build these relationships, and it takes people who come in with intentionality and time to really champion this. So yeah, as Michelle said, it's not going to happen overnight, but I think small actions can be the catalyst that starts this kind of chain that will build over time.
And there are different ways to get into it, right? One of our partners is scaling a program called Connect and Prepare, and it helps to get neighbors either on a block or in a building together to connect with each other, but also but in the service of preparing for emergencies together. And lots of different kinds of projects actually come out of that, right? People do neighborhood projects together. They create a garden in the lawn that nobody's using. They create buddy systems and communication systems, and they trade information around what kind of skills and abilities they have, what they can teach each other. All sorts of things can come out of it. You just sometimes have to find the way in or the project that might get kind of people out of their homes and into a conversation. All right, let's do one last question, Ryan, and then we will close it up.
Okay. This goes back to funders of projects. Sort of two things here. Well, I think one was already addressed. Funding programs favor building as many units as possible. How do we reconcile the need for well-designed sociable housing with funding requirements? To tie into that is, how are you working with funders so projects have the capital required to build this style of project, especially where apartments and pro-social design are not yet present in a suburb or area?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a bit of a slow process. We're Hey Neighbor has a tiny backbone team, but lots of partners, and Happy Cities even is, not a ginormous consultancy. But I think we are doing it through showcasing examples by getting, different players into conversation together that don't normally meet, right? We do a lot of convening where we're inviting in public health and architects and the housing sector and community nonprofits. So I mean, really the the kind of folks who are on this call right now, right, goes back to that chart I showed you. We all need to be talking about this together because, public health folks understand why we need to do this, right? They understand the ramifications of loneliness, social isolation, the impact of the built environment, but they're not housing developers. They're not funding housing. So we need to be having these conversations together to kind of create the mind shifts and the professional practice shifts that actually make this easier for everybody. And and then communicate around actual and perceived barriers to this, right? Like, is this kind of design really more expensive? Not necessarily. And it is such a small fraction of the entire cost of a project that it could be seen as insignificant. And if you can build a good health rationale for it, then the downstream benefits of that could be quite significant. So it's also expanding our thinking to, okay, yes, maybe there's a 5%, lift to do, some fancier things here. But that 5% is going to yield so much benefit, down the line that it's well worth it. But it's not easy getting people out of mindsets around just quantity of supply and number of units. It's not an easy thing.
Yeah, and I think one thing that is happening in Canada right now is a lot of conversation around standardized and pre-approved designs.
Yeah.
And yeah, love them or hate them. It's a conversation that is happening across different
Well,
funders.
and it has to because
Yeah.
of the crunching of the labor sector and
Yeah. So for us, that is one area that we are working on actively is getting in conversations with those folks and seeing like, what should you be including in your standardized designs to make sure that this this area is acknowledged in terms of social interaction.
Yeah. All right. I know that we have left lots of questions unanswered. We do always save the chats, and sometimes in our wrap-up features with the video, we will kind of pull out some interesting tidbits from the chat, or even answer some questions we didn't get to in the live session. So don't be too upset if your question didn't get answered. We may do so in a follow-up post. We might reach out. If you want to reach out to us, please do that evaluation survey. Noni, let's put it in one last time. It does have space within there to request that we reach out to you for a chat. So we're happy to do that. Okay. Thanks to everybody in the background, to Ryan and Noni for helping with questions and technical facilitation, and for all of you for taking 60 minutes plus 11 minutes. So 71 minutes with us. Have a wonderful day, everybody.
Thank you so much.